This is Arnold Michaelis. The program is Insight, an insight into the minds and hearts of the outstanding personalities of our times. Through the medium of relaxed and informal conversation in the privacy of one's home, we have an opportunity to go below the surface of mere personality, the flipness of superficial thought, and come to grips with what people really are, rather than what we think them to be because of their professional exteriors. During these weeks in Hollywood, it's been an exciting adventure for me, as well as a great privilege, to talk with some of the finest, most substantial, and public-spirited human beings I've ever met. Such a person is Ronald Reagan, for years one of the best-known actors in the business. Ronnie distinguished himself in serving as president of the Screen Actors Guild from 1947 through 1952, and for the past number of years he's further distinguished himself in serving the General Electric Theater as host, program supervisor, and actor in some of the plays. Ronnie invited me to his home in Pacific Palisades, where he gave me the grand tour of one of the most unusual houses in the country. Then we settled comfortably in his study, and our conversation began as we reminisced about his life as a radio sports announcer just about 22 years ago. Did I detect a somewhat nostalgic cast in your voice invoking the word radio?
Well, yes, and I sort of regret now what seems to have happened to radio, and maybe they gave up a little too soon on some of the things they were doing. Today, radio just seems to have settled down to a half a dozen disc jockeys on each station and canned music.
Well, tonight you're the exception.
Well, maybe this is the forerunner of a revival. And what you're doing is a very fine thing, because radio lately, I think, as I said before, has neglected this whole field of communication. And I've always believed that an awful lot of the problems in the world would disappear if more people would talk to each other, a little less about each other. The idea that through this medium, so simply and easily as we sit here and talk, you can bring to people the thoughts of whether the listener agrees with the thoughts or not. At least
you don't always agree with you don't always agree with your wife.
No. And I didn't mean to say that no so hastily. We get along very well. But an old man that was very happily married once told me that no married man could have trouble very much as long as he remembered frequently to say, "Yes, dear."
You're right. It's incredible for me to be sitting here with you in 1958 when I remember so clearly and vividly Brother Rat and Boy Meets Girl in 1938. I'm sorry to have to do that to you, but there's no way I can get around the fact that you made those pictures in 1938.
That's right. Of course, I was very young at the time.
We both were. I hasten to add, we both were.
You know, I've often wondered if it's the same with other people as it is with me, that the war, the 4 years that I was gone during the war, seems to have done something in my own sense of time. It's as if those 4 years were taken out and then, like tape being spliced together,
Exactly.
It didn't count. Because I know that I still think of myself as still starting in. Because I know that when I went into the Army, I was a newcomer virtually in pictures and felt of myself as still, just with a toe in the door trying. And you sort of forget that the audience and the rest of the people in the business while you were gone, there were some of your pictures still going around and some you'd made still being played. By the time I came out of the Army, I was accepted as, an old standby. I'd been around for a while. But I came out of the Army still thinking of myself as beginning in pictures.
Well, I think some of the roles that you were cast in during that period bears out the feeling that you had, even though some people may have felt you were an old standby at that point. Look at the voice of the turtle, which didn't happen until when, 47?
That's right.
Well, you were still the raging juvenile at that point. As a matter of fact, you still look like a raging juvenile.
Oh, thank you very much. But come midnight, I turn into a pumpkin.
Well, this house, of course, which we've all seen on so many occasions, on those delightful commercials which you and Nancy do for General Electric, I think it's the most interesting house I've ever been in. And everything in it seems to have been supplied by General Electric, with the possible exception of your 7-week-old namesake.
Well...
how did they manage to stay out of that?
I don't know. It's... I guess it was just the summer replacement season.
Well, they're different currents anyway.
Yes.
I think the niche that you have with General Electric is really unique in our field of entertainment.
Yes. This situation is unique in television. I don't know of any of my colleagues that are engaged in exactly the same type of setup that we have. But you see, the General Electric show is not wholly a selling show. In other words, it isn't a show with a product that now sells. It's the public relations show, a program of institutional advertising.
Yes.
And so in connection with that, the program furthers the General Electric public relations policies, which are incorporated in an expression of called employee and community relations. And Mr. Cordner, was the president of General Electric and now the chairman of the board, is one of the first industrialists in this country to really put into practice a program of decentralization. And the General Electric Company is really decentralized, not only just in name. They have over 165 plants in 38 states. And when he decentralized not only geographically that way, he gave each one of these plants virtual autonomy. And the result was they had a problem of trying to keep all these scattered people, sort of feeling that they weren't orphans, that they still belonged to the company. And at the same time, they want in these many communities their people to have their first loyalty to the community. They don't want to go into a town and then have the employees feel, well, we're just in here on a lease. We don't really belong to this town. They're very proud of the fact that their people are on the school boards and participate in the community affairs.
Well, then the management and labor relationships of a company like General Electric have really become a great deal more complex, probably, than any other major corporation in the country.
Yes, and I think they have laid down a challenge to organized labor. Now, you mentioned that I was an officer of the Screen Actors Guild, which is an AFL union, and I am still an officer of that. So I am now speaking from the standpoint of labor, and I'm looking at General Electric and what I've learned, because a part of my job now is twice a year going around the country to the plant cities, meeting the employees, participating in whatever community functions are going on in that community that General Electric wants to be a part of and tries to be a part of, such as sometimes participating in charity drives or being a speaker at the annual Chamber of Commerce meeting or something. And I have to say, from the standpoint of labor, the General Electric has issued quite a challenge, and organized labor better look around and review their own attitudes in the face of this very enlightened policy toward the people who work for them. And it's as simple as this, that the man who works for you in a company is also the customer. You can't wear two hats. You can't browbeat him at one stage of the day and then when he's out shopping, adopt a policy of the customer is always right.
Well, now, you say that their policies are far-sighted and benevolent policies from the corporate standpoint.
That's right.
Well, now, as president of the Screen Actors Guild, you had to negotiate contracts with various picture studios out here, didn't you?
Yes.
Well, now, supposing that you were trying to negotiate a labor contract with General Electric, don't you think that you'd be impressed by the type of program they've set up?
Yes, I would.
Well, and don't you think that labor is bound to adjust to the kind of beneficence you suggest that General Electric reflects now in its management labor policies?
Yes, very definitely. But what I think I was trying to say was that I think right at the moment, not overall, but in some areas, particularly among some of the, let's say, older, more old-fashioned labor leaders, there is a reluctance to accept this new attitude on the part of management. There are still those in labor who want to keep it a contest, a battle, a class war.
Don't you think this is labor's growing pains, actually?
Yes. Yes, I think this is the first time they have ever, these recent years, felt and had the strength they now have. And I think they're still coming out of now, again, remember, I'm speaking of isolated individuals.
Oh, of course, of course.
There's still a tendency to say, well, now is our chance, let's get even.
Yeah.
And they've got to outgrow this. They've got to realize that there's no room for this anymore.
Well, don't you think, too, that this is a byproduct of the thing that we call human nature? Our whole system appears to be founded on a basis of competition. Sometimes competition, when it's naked, can get rather ugly.
Yes.
Because then you overlook the point of view of your competitor because of your dogged determination to win your point. Don't you think now we're ushering in the age of massive reconciliation?
That's a pretty good phrase, yes. And
I stole it, by the way. I don't want to take credit for it. Some newly elected president of a Protestant ministers' conference invoked that phrase, and it made a great impression on me a few weeks ago. He said that he thought this was the age where we really should invoke a progressive and aggressive policy of massive reconciliation.
Well, I think he's very right. And the funny thing about labor is that labor could turn to the past and get a pretty good lesson in this, because the great man of labor, Samuel Gompers, if you go back and review, you'll find that Gompers, even at the most bitter moments when he was being really assailed by narrow-minded reactionaries and side of management, never lost sight of the fact and never ceased saying that labor and management must be partners in this free enterprise system. He was always against a strike. He always said that there had been poor leadership if you had to strike.
I think one of the keys to the solution is, again, what you set forth before about General Electric pursuing the kind of policy it has been in the last number of years. I think big business, so-called, has become a great deal more conscious of its responsibilities to the community. When we say that labor and management must be partners, I think they both must be partners in recognizing their mutual responsibilities to the community at large.
Yes, General Electric uses the phrase corporate citizenship, that the corporation itself is a citizen and, as you say, has a responsibility as a corporate citizen in the community. And I think that modern industry would be the first to admit that back in the 30s and previous to the 30s, leading up to the Great Depression, that there was no such thing as corporate citizenship, and that management was responsible for the creation of organized labor because they were unwilling to recognize their responsibility and their obligation to their fellow citizens.
Well, that's why I think this is probably getting into the balancing age now between labor and management, where labor has now gotten its tremendous power. There's no question but what greedy and avaricious capital has been responsible for the creation of the vacuum that caused labor to come into being as strong as it has.
Yes, and now labor must be willing in this massive reconciliation to realize that those same policies no longer hold, that management itself has recognized its earlier sins and repents. I think also we're into the era now where in achieving this strength, labor gave away, when I say labor now, I mean the laboring people gave away a great many of their democratic rights. In other words, as we do in war, they chose a leader and they gave the leader full power to wage this war. And we're now in that spot where we must begin to take back into the hands of the rank and file membership more of our democratic rights.
But democratic rights appear to me only to be realized when there's an awareness on the part of the constituents of either a labor union or a nation. The individuals themselves, if there isn't the awareness, you can't have true democracy practiced because people aren't aware of their responsibilities.
I think the investigation that's going on today reveals that basically is the fault. The things that have gone on because power corrupts, and for too long, you take a great international union and you realize that a man could be president of that union for more than 40 years as an absolute dictator, to such an extent that when he did die, his son just inherited the position. Well, this is so far removed from anything we consider democratic that it's time for a review and getting back to the... I'd like to see in labor unions a few more hassles about who's going to be elected president of the labor union.
When you were president of the Screen Actors Guild, you hadn't actually had any formalized training for that highly important post in one of the top labor guilds in the country. How did you adjust to all this, Ronnie, particularly in your relationships with the people whom you had worked with for years? I'm thinking of Warner Brothers, essentially. What did it do to you to have to take a very strong and militant stand for the points you believed in?
Well, let me say that there's a very unique situation here, that the Screen Actors Guild is one of the few unions I know in which the running of the union is done by the working members. There are no salaried officers. And when you sit down in a negotiation for wages and working conditions, the working members do the negotiating. And with all of the faults that there may be on the side of management in the picture business, and I have never taken second place to anyone in citing those faults, I think the management of the picture business has been short-sighted in many ways and has been backward, way behind modern industry in many practices and ideas. But in this one regard, I must give them full credit, that throughout the history of the Screen Actors Guild, we the actors have sat on one side of the table and have battled and fought in negotiations over these regular wages and working conditions and so forth. And never once have I seen any enmity carried out of the room so that some actor on one side of the table then found himself a victim or discriminated against by the employers on the other side. I've been present in some late-night sessions where you were really pounding the table and screaming at each other. And the strange thing was I have seen actors under contract to a studio. And the actor under contract pounding the table was shaking his finger under the nose of, and it was going on the other way too, of the executive of the studio for which he worked. I must say the labor relations in this business could serve as a pretty good example to most of industry in that regard. But now you ask, this is getting far afield from your question, how did it seem?
To you personally, as an individual?
Well, I suppose I kind of inherited that attitude that was already present in the guild management relations, and it never occurred to me to not say something I thought or felt for fear of any eventual harm to myself. As I say, I'm not alone in this. It didn't to anyone else.
When actually did the Screen Actors Guild come into being? When was it founded?
Well, they started organizing way back in about 1932 or 3. They didn't actually achieve their first contract with the studio, recognition as a bargaining agent, until 1937, which is also the first year I came into this business.
Exactly. Did you become a member of the Guild as soon as you came into the business?
Yes. That was part of the first basic agreement. We have in the picture business, I guess you have to call it union shop. It is union shop. We have never subscribed to and do not believe in closed shop. Monopoly is wrong. It's wrong if it's government monopoly, it's wrong if it's business monopoly, and it certainly is wrong if it's a labor monopoly. All that we have in the line of an agreement, however, is that the studios can hire anyone they want to hire as a performer, an actor. We recognize that talent must continually be found. It's the lifeblood of our business. Now, the studios, on the other hand, agree that once they hire a performer, that performer will become a member of our guild.
You're regarded out in this Hollywood area, Ronnie, as a highly public-spirited citizen, which I gather you have denied. But your record of activity sustains that belief about you. And I wonder what that sprung from. Now, you studied sociology at college, didn't you?
Yes.
Did you study that because it seemed to be a convenient course, or did you actually have a desire to?
No, I must confess, it was a convenient course. Actually, my main interest in college was football.
That's a form of sociology.
Yes. And I was looking for a course that would allow me to retain my eligibility without cutting into football practice too heavily with study.
Sociology, I'm sure, interfered terribly.
Yes, but less than any of the other majors would.
But it must have made an inroad upon your thinking.
Yes, I've noticed about myself that the things that I was forced to read, in outside reading and so forth, in economics and sociology, and that I tried to duck and get out of in college, I now find myself reading for pleasure, articles and non-fiction material of that kind. So it must have made a dent. I think also that all of us who grew up in the Depression started off with an awareness that most young people don't have about what's going on in the world. Suddenly it was forced on you. This was the very comfortable world that you'd started to grow up in which Papa was responsible for feeding you and all that. It went out the window, and you began to question, well, why and what's going to happen to all of us. I know 1932 was not exactly the year to get out of college and look for a job.
Hardly.
My first job, I got $100 a month, and I bought a meal ticket for $3.25 at a cafeteria that was open 6 days of the week, wasn't open Sunday. And it seems strange to think that that $3.25 meal ticket bought me 3 meals a day in that cafeteria for 6 days.
That's a study in sociology all by itself.
Yes.
No, but you're right. I'm sure that the Depression years did a great deal to all of us. I think it helped a great many of us. I think it hurt, and probably irreparably hurt, many others.
Yes.
But I think it did contribute an awareness as to what was going on in our world, which maybe isn't as prevalent today. But I just wondered how much of an effect your formal study of sociology had upon this apparent drive that you have, Ronnie, to contribute to your community and to the public weal.
Well, now, I can't, I would like to sit quietly and modestly subscribe to what you've just credited me with.
Well, the record indicates
but
it.
I actually, though,
away
I think
from
it starts with a kind of selfishness. I think that you You get into these things because they do affect you personally in your destiny, your career, and you feel a necessity for having a voice in this. You don't want to sit back and let someone else decide all of the things that are going to become factors in your life and living.
Yeah, but most people do. I think you're by far the exception, and people like you are the exception. I was talking with Eddie Albert last week about his adoption of this little Spanish girl. Do you know about that?
I read about it. I haven't seen Eddie since he got back.
Yes, he was in Spain a few weeks ago and adopted this little 4-year-old girl, blonde little girl, Maria, who's absolutely enchanting. And in talking with Eddie about it, I said I thought it was such a wonderful act, because I think any couple, having children of their own or not having children, who do adopt orphans, really contribute something magnificent in this world to them. And he said, well, no, he said, basically, I think it's selfishness. Well, it's interesting to me now that so many people I confront with specific acts of theirs, they immediately translate, I think somewhat defensively, into terms of selfishness. Well, I subscribe to this brand of selfishness, and I say more of it.
I'd like more selfishness of Eddie's brand there. Then all of the people in our business must be very selfish, because did you know that the people of the motion picture colony, proportionate numbers, lead the nation in the adoption of children?
No, I didn't. That's a very interesting point.
There's a great deal of that, and of course I could see Eddie and Margot doing it very much. They're very nice people.
They're wonderful people. But really, this brand of selfishness, which I think is, I'll have to label defensive selfishness, is a very interesting point, because it somehow embarrasses us to be singled out and say we have done something good, we've done something of value. Why in heaven's name should we feel that way?
I don't know. Don't you think, though, that we, nationally, we act that way? I'm always a little amused at the great efforts that we use in this foreign aid program to try and explain and say to everyone, now, you realize we're not doing this because we're generous. We're doing it only really to defend ourselves. Yes. The truth of the matter is, you go back through the whole history of the United States, this country's always been first in line to help anyone out, any place in the world, and it is because basically the American people are generous.
And that is an insight into the thinking and personality of Ronald Reagan, one of Hollywood's finest citizens. Next week's insight will be into the mind and heart of John Payne, the producer and star of The Restless Gun. Through the character of Vint Bonner, John combines a man of action with a deep awareness of life's real values and blends them into a weekly series of outstanding entertainment. Next week's insight into John Payne. This is Arnold Michaelis.